In September 2022, Netflix released Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. The series told the story of one of America's most notorious serial killers, who predominantly preyed on young gay men of color. Monster was the ultimate trauma porn content and was rife with controversy from the start, with the victims' families saying the series re-traumatized them. But something arguably just as sinister emerged from the series. A lust for Dahmer across social media that went so viral, it quickly became a trend. This trend saw users brag about how unbothered they were by the Dahmer series, featuring the show's theme song as the sound played on their videos. Users displayed empathy for the serial killer, made fan edits and thirst traps of him, and one creator, who even donned earrings with Dahmer's face on them, went so far as to lament that the show wasn't morbid enough for her. While content that depicts traumatic stories and events is nothing new, social media's reception to Monster marked a tangible shift in how audiences consume tragedy in the digital age. This leaves us with the question, how has the modern era of online culture influenced the sharing of trauma porn? And possibly more importantly, are we, as the consumers, accountable for the ethical implications of this content too? From Centennial World, I'm Lauren Meisner, and this is Infinite Scroll, a podcast about internet culture, the creator economy, and how social media is shaping Gen Z. Welcome back to Infinite Scroll, everyone. If you guys don't listen to Mini Scroll, then you might have no idea what I am doing in this bedroom. This is the bedroom at my parents' house. They moved up to our cottage when they retired, so this is like some cottagecore vibes right now. Putting on a full glam to record at the cottage is so cursed, but honestly, it's just what I need. Anyways, so I'm going to be here until the end of August, until I go on my Europe trip. One of my best friends from home is getting married, so I'm going to be recording here for the next, I think it's 3 weeks, until the end of August. And then I go away for 2 weeks. I am going on a Europe trip because one of my best friends from home is getting married in Italy, so I am taking 2 weeks off. So you guys will have to fend without me for 2 weeks, and then I will be back in studio mid-September. So as always, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. It helps me so much. It helps me grow. We sadly did not hit 5,000 subscribers on YouTube at the end of last week. I really thought we would. We were like on quite a roll there, and it really slowed down, and that's just kind of how it is on YouTube. But please subscribe, even if you guys don't watch on YouTube, because I'm really trying to hit 5,000. Please sign up to our newsletter, which is called Infinite Scroll. On Fridays, we round up the 5 biggest think pieces on the internet that you needed to know, and join our Geneva group called Infinite Scroll, where you can chat with other people who are obsessed with internet culture and drama and tea, and you can chat with me. So I have 2 reviews that I wanted to read today. They are YouTube comments. Carson West says, I'm so blessed to be in on this secret of Mini Scroll. Seeing the notification of a new video each day really brings me so much joy. Thank you so much. Oh my God. Thank you so much. That means so much to me. I never know how I feel about Mini Scroll. It's obviously a lot of work, and I want it to be like beneficial for you guys. I want you guys to enjoy it. So that means a lot. And then Existentialist at Best 7302 on YouTube said, I am just absolutely floored that you don't have more subscribers. Same. I found your channel a few weeks ago, and I just love the concept, love your videos, and that you're continuing to post while you travel. Thank you. It's a mission, I have to say, to post while I'm traveling. It's been a whole thing to figure out like what the setup is, and I'm recording with natural light, whereas in the studio, obviously I have lights, and you know, I am not like a videographer, a photographer, and I don't know, the concept of the fact that like it can look so different, like the lighting can look so different, the coloring of the video can look so different just based on what it looks like outside, like if the sun is out, if it's not, it's gonna take some getting used to this month. All right, so as you guys probably realized from the intro and, the title of this episode, today we're going to be exploring TikTok and trauma porn, how the consumption of tragedy manifests in the digital age. So trigger warning for this episode, it will contain discussions about police violence, murder, abuse, and other topics that listeners may consider traumatic. So please click out now if you are just not in that headspace. As politics, the news, and pop culture become increasingly intertwined, it's nearly impossible to avoid content online. Staying up to date on global events is extremely important. But these days, as we all doom scroll through our feeds, it feels like social media is filled with disaster, hatred, and war. While the 24-hour news cycle and rise of citizen journalism allow us to gain insight into perspectives in parts of the world that we wouldn't otherwise, it simultaneously exposes us to a host of traumatic content. This, in turn, leaves social media inundated with a flood of graphic images and videos, ultimately contributing to the widespread adoption of trauma porn-style content. Trauma porn isn't limited to the digital realm. In fact, it has long been used in journalistic endeavors and various literary pursuits. As noted by Dylan Matthews for Vox, quote, communication scholars have found that across many years and countries, coverage of political topics tends to more often be conveyed in a negative or cynical tone rather than a positive one. While bad news is what might keep viewers captivated, it is a slippery slope from a negative bias to trauma porn. From our research, there doesn't seem to be one unified definition of trauma porn. Rather, it's become customary for many writers and cultural pundits to acknowledge the slippery nature of the term. However, two main interpretations seem to prevail. The first is more generic. Take Urban Dictionary's definition, for example. There, trauma porn is described as a literary phenomenon when, quote, a writer glorifies trauma in their writing, exaggerating aspects for the sake of angst. In this context, the aim is to evoke pathos in the audience. It's not necessarily about diving into the effects of trauma, but showcasing trauma merely to drive the plot. This approach is common among true crime podcasters and creators who often detail horrific cases, commodifying trauma and tragedy in the process. While many strive to treat these stories with the gravity they deserve, they're often edited with suspenseful music, a strong narrative voice, and presented by familiar creators with whom audiences have a parasocial relationship with. This often results in the fictionalization of the very real trauma behind these stories, as we saw in 2022 with the romanticization of serial killers Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy. The second interpretation of trauma porn focuses on the way it evokes emotion for entertainment and who it is specifically for. Brittany Johnson, writing for The Mighty, a healthcare platform that allows people to share their stories in a safe environment, describes trauma porn as, quote, media that showcases a group's pain and trauma in excessive amounts for the sake of entertainment. As Johnson rightly points out, this often disproportionately impacts minorities and marginalized groups. In these instances, their trauma is put on display, often for the benefit of non-marginalized groups, making them, quote, feel better about themselves in relation to these issues. More on that later. Of course, it is worth noting that not all stories or content involving traumatic incidents are inherently trauma porn. This distinction here lies in three key factors. First, trauma porn is inherently capitalistic, seeking to commodify these stories for monetary gain. It's driven by profit rather than a genuine intent to inform or educate. Second, it is exploitative, often showcasing trauma for shock value rather than warning audiences or presenting the content respectfully. And lastly, trauma porn is more often than not unproductive. It doesn't offer any solutions or constructive dialogue about the situation, but instead leaves the audience entertained or feeling good because being upset or enraged by the content validates for audience members that they're compassionate, in some twisted way. In contrast, media and content that address trauma and tragedy with sensitivity and care, providing trigger warnings and resources, fostering introspection, and encouraging meaningful conversation, should not fall under the category of trauma porn. These respectful approaches aim to inform and engage audiences in a more productive manner. Now, there are closely related concepts to trauma porn, such as tragedy porn and poverty porn. Tragedy porn typically refers to a literary technique where a tragic or sad story is told but offers little discussion or resources around the issue. Poverty porn, on the other hand, is more specific. As Kat Higgins, a lecturer in media and culture at the University of London, tells Vox, this type of content sees, quote, poverty as something that is shocking, disgusting, or funny, as opposed to a structural problem demanding structural responses. Conversations on social media around trauma porn often overlap with examples of tragedy porn and poverty porn, so it is worth giving them a mention to get the full picture. For the purpose of this episode, I'll be referring to trauma porn as a term that encompasses both poverty and tragedy porn as well. With that being said, trauma porn has become a controversial topic in the digital space. Discussions about this type of content have been around for years, but they gained significant traction around 2020, particularly during the Black Lives Matter protests following the death of George Floyd. Through this period, much of the conversation around trauma porn started within Black communities on social media. With this, we will primarily draw on commentary from Black voices for this part of the podcast to ensure that we are platforming these perspectives, since this period and content affected the Black community most significantly. In a 2020 piece published by journalist and activist Ashley Marie Preston for Marie Claire, she recounts how the George Floyd video impacted her. Quote, "After seeing the footage, I was overcome by inconsolable frustration. Not only was I angry I'd been caught off guard, the video played automatically when I scrolled past it," she writes. "I was also upset that thousands of white Americans whose unwillingness to help dismantle systemic racism made George Floyd vulnerable to police brutality were now given front row seats to voyeuristically consume his pain." Preston's reaction highlights some of the major issues that many marginalized groups have with trauma porn. They are often forced to relive their trauma and intergenerational pain for the benefit of the majority, specifically white, straight, cisgender, and neurotypical people. This is something Brittany Johnson points out in her piece for The Mighty, writing, quote, "When trauma porn is created surrounding the experience, to put it lightly, of what it means to be marginalized, it is never made with the marginalized group in mind. Thus, the art can further trigger said marginalized group." The impact of trauma porn was significant during this era on social media. Preston, in her piece, goes on to note the similarities between spreading traumatic videos of police brutality and racially motivated lynchings throughout the early 1900s. Quote, "Today, society takes part in a modern-day form of lynching. Sharing trauma porn," she says. "The method may have changed, but the motivation is still the same. The extreme discomfort you feel when reading about last century's lynchings is similar to the discomfort many Black people feel when viral videos of us being publicly murdered are shared all over the internet." Other commentators have drawn similar conclusions. In a blog post for Medium, PhD candidate Joy Brooks Gilzane discussed how the rapid spread of trauma porn across the viral space is deeply desensitizing, where this level of exposure might lead users to become, quote, "numb to violence against Black bodies." Similarly, Indigo Ross for the Odyssey Online notes that this hyperconsumption is almost a fetish for the United States, one that is extremely damaging for audiences. And lastly, Dr. Elfie Breland-Noble, psychologist and founder of the AAKOMA project, emphasized in a 2020 interview how many of these visuals continue to dehumanize Black people. Quote, "If this was your loved one, would you want other people consuming that?" she questioned, referring to the video of police brutality circulating at the time. Dr. Breland-Noble also noted that consuming this content can lead to, quote, "secondary and vicarious trauma" for many people of color who are already acutely aware of the fear and pain that comes with being a Black person in America, especially as racism continues to run rampant. However, for some, this is precisely why this content should be shared. Many social media users argue that spreading these graphic images and videos raises awareness and shows the lived experience of so many. While raising awareness and fostering allyship are important, much of the commentary from Black perspectives suggests that this is not the most effective approach. As Australian scholars Kathomi Gatwiri and Virginia Mappetzama write, quote, "Black trauma porn creates white hyperconsumption and does so without any transformative power." Preston makes a similar point in her piece for Marie Claire, noting that, quote, "Sharing images of Black death on social media won't save Black lives. Instead of eradicating our murders, it normalizes them. Year after year, life after life, innocent Black blood is spilled, and yet the system responsible is left intact." Of course, discussions around trauma porn extend beyond the Black Lives Matter movement, though it remains one of the most covered periods in social media activism. Similar discourse has emerged around other distressing events like wars and true crime. Nevertheless, the questions remain largely consistent. How can social media users balance sharing real-life content and unfortunately graphic content to raise awareness and reveal the realities of oppression and conflict, while also protecting the marginalized groups directly affected by these situations? To effectively address these concerns, let's reflect on why we continue to engage with trauma porn in the first place. Much of the existing commentary suggests that we choose to watch and share trauma porn online for rather selfish reasons. During the height of the Black Lives Matter protests, for instance, many people, especially white people, might have used this traumatic content to perform allyship. Because of this element of performance, online activism is sometimes referred to as slacktivism, an effort-free way for someone to perform activism or allyship without actually having to take their efforts offline. Quote, clicking the share button on an Instagram infographic requires significantly less effort than having difficult conversations with close friends and family, Brooke Gilzane continues in her Medium piece. I am by no means suggesting that sharing information is futile or counterproductive. I'm instead suggesting that we show greater consideration to our peers before sharing. While the criticisms around slacktivism are mixed, with some studies suggesting that online activism does not inherently harm or hinder offline activism, Dr. Sarah Lucy for the University of Kentucky found that more often than not, individuals who engage in online activism treat it as a trend. And all of us who spend a lot of time online can see that, right? When something really major happens in the news or in culture, our feeds are flooded with trending infographics shared by celebrities, influencers, and tons of regular people that we know. These shares are meant to communicate to the wider audience that they care. This performance also comes with conditions. Not only does sharing this infographic mean that they care, but it's become widely accepted that if you don't share that infographic, then you don't care. And you couldn't possibly be doing anything offline to help because you're not posting anything online. And so we can see how engaging in online activism becomes a trend. It can be something that people perform online to prove to others that they are good people. Now, that's a really simplified explanation. It doesn't apply to everyone, of course, and I know in many cases, sharing and spreading information online is vital to a cause. But there are clear links to the sharing of traumatic content online and the sharer's motivation of wanting to stand on a higher moral ground than others by sharing this content under the guise of allyship, whether they actually realize that or not. Though sharing traumatic content might benefit someone's public image during a movement or crisis, consuming this type of content can be more intrinsically motivated. Watching content that showcases things like violence, poverty, murder, addiction, and mental health challenges feeds our negativity bias. Negativity bias is a term that describes humans' tendency to be drawn to bad news. This can be partly explained by our inherent need to protect ourselves from threats, and partly due to our own morbid fascination with how bad the world can really be. A 2014 experiment by researchers Mark Trussler and Stuart Sikora at the University of McGill in Canada found that we pay attention to bad news more than good news because it's human nature to believe that our lives are better than most others. Quote, when it comes to our own lives, most of us believe we're better than average, and that, like the cliches, we expect things to be all right in the end, writes Tom Stafford for the BBC in reporting on this research. Quote, this pleasant view of the world makes bad news all the more surprising and salient. It is only against a light background that the dark spots are highlighted. So our attraction to bad news might be more complex than just journalistic cynicism or a hunger springing from the darkness within. This belief that we're better than average is called illusory superiority, and there are a few theories as to why we perceive ourselves like this when compared to others. But egocentrism, which is the idea that we place greater emphasis on our abilities, characteristics, and decisions and behaviors than others, is a primary one. Basically, we believe we have advantages that others don't have. In this context, watching trauma porn feeds that egocentrism, making us feel better about our own lives and our own decisions while confirming that inherent belief that we are better than average. If you asked the average social media user, however, why they engage with this type of content, they likely wouldn't say that it's because it feeds their ego. Instead, we see a lot of discussion online about how this type of content helps users trauma bond with others who have experienced similar situations. The term trauma bond was first coined in 1997 by Patrick J. Carnes, the founder of the International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals. The term describes the bond formed between an abuser and a non-abuser, which creates a dysfunctional attachment style, where the victim of abuse may display, quote, a highly addictive attachment to the person who hurt them. Now, as with many clinical terms, social media users frequently misuse it, and the meaning has been diluted. Quote, unfortunately, the trend of overusing or misusing terms such as trauma bonding dilutes the meaning and significance of serious mental health concerns, Clinical psychologist Dr. Carla Manley told Salon.com. For example, when people on TikTok casually state that they are trauma bonded with their coworkers due to employment issues, they are unknowingly using a term that is intended to describe a relationship where a victim is bonded to a perpetrator who is engaged in repeated cyclical abuse. In the context of engaging with trauma porn online, we can look to 2010's Tumblr as an early marker of this term being co-opted, where posts and blogs that glorified self-harm, mental illness, and pro-eating disorder behaviors were some of the most popular content on the platform. Users defended that this content provided a sense of connection and community among people dealing with these issues through shared trauma bonding. But in reality, the content was extremely dangerous and usually quite self-serving. With many of us naturally drawn to trauma porn for various reasons, it benefits creators to capitalize on this kind of content. While exploiting trauma and tragedy for monetary gain and clout is definitely a bit dystopian, content creators will often do whatever they can to maintain influence in today's attention-driven economy. For those unfamiliar with this concept, the term attention economy was coined by U.S. political scientist Herbert A. Simon back in the 1960s. Essentially, he characterized the scarcity of attention as an economic problem. Although this idea might seem distant from today's digital world, it has come to define how many marketers, social media experts, and journalists view how the internet and its operatives, corporations and creators alike, compete for our focus. Quote, "This economy, which sees our focus as a finite resource to be captured and monetized, has fundamentally altered how we connect," Kurt Steinhorst writes for Forbes. It poses significant challenges that threaten to undermine the quality of our attention, our relationships, and our understanding of the world. Of course, TikTok has only intensified the attention economy. Not only did TikTok bring short-form content back to the zeitgeist, but the infinite scroll interface on the For You page makes content more accessible than ever. As a result, capturing and holding attention has become even more challenging. Within this context, if trauma is what draws an audience in, many creators are willing to exploit it. We've seen numerous individuals leverage trauma to grow their followings or maintain their influence. These creators generally fall into two categories: those who exploit their own trauma and those who use the trauma of others for personal gain. While both approaches generate confronting content, the latter is especially concerning. These creators often position themselves as saviors while profiting from others' suffering. One contentious example of this is Soft White Underbelly. Soft White Underbelly is a YouTube channel that was established on April 25, 2016 by photographer Mark Leda. The channel has become renowned for sharing interviews and portraits of society's overlooked and underprivileged. The channel features conversations with a diverse range of people, including homeless people and drug addicts. The earliest video on Soft White Underbelly was posted on May 11, 2016. Since then, a few fan-favorite interviewees have emerged, notably Amanda, a homeless woman, sex worker, and drug addict. Mark's first interview with Amanda was posted on December 2019, where he continued documenting her journey through rehab, recovery, and her untimely death in May 2021. Meanwhile, another fan favorite is the Whitakers, an Appalachian family with an alleged history of inbreeding, which has led to various genetic defects among some family members. The most popular video on the Soft White Underbelly channel is a visit to the Whitakers' home in Aude, West Virginia, which has accumulated over 42 million views. Most recently, Soft White Underbelly went viral for an interview with Cosmo Lombino, a wardrobe stylist in Los Angeles who has led a very eventful life. While the interview was posted in March, clips began circulating on X a couple of months later, with the most popular one featuring Cosmo discussing her ties to the mob and her family's struggles with addiction. While Mark's intention with the channel may seem noble, his supporters claim he humanizes people shunned by society, he creates GoFundMes for interviewees, and he offers money to homeless individuals on Skid Row for interviews. His approach raises some ethical concerns. Many critics argue that Soft White Underbelly is another example of trauma porn and poverty porn. They question whether many of his subjects can actively give consent, especially since many are suffering from drug addiction and may be under the influence during the interview sessions or when Mark coordinates the meetings. Given that Mark doesn't have a background as a psychologist or a social worker, many viewers have questioned the methods he uses to source participants and his general approach to interviews. Quote, "I used to find these YouTube videos interesting, but the absolute lack of empathy from the viewers is sickening. Mark Leda is not qualified for this, and it seems he has a savior complex," one ex-user writes. On top of this, there have been concerns about whether the money from various GoFundMe campaigns actually reaches the intended recipients. Earlier this year, for instance, allegations emerged that funds raised for the Whitakers were not making it to the family. This came to light when YouTuber Tyler Oliveira visited West Virginia. Before arriving, he reached out to Mark, asking for an introduction to the Whitaker family. A member of the Soft White Underbelly team revealed that the Whitakers had a contract to film exclusively with Mark for content creation and were, quote, in talks about a television series with a broadcast network. Tyler then contacted Paige, another woman who remains in touch with the Whitakers, who encouraged him to bring groceries to the family. While visiting the Whitakers, Tyler asked about updates on the house, which was the goal of Mark's GoFundMe campaign for the family. Betty, the matriarch, said she hadn't heard about anything, raising questions about where the money was going. Quote, Oliveira tells the Whitakers he bets there's $50,000 or $60,000 in the fundraising account, but doesn't quite explain why he believes that to be true. His video doesn't outright accuse Leda of fraud, but pretty aggressively raises questions about what Leda does with the GoFundMe donations he collects for the family, writes Vox. Mark responded with a video of his own, stating that the channel and the GoFundMe have, quote, generated a lot of money for the Whitakers. However, he noted that some family members frequently call him for money. He provided screenshots showing that he has wired money to Betty and explained that the number of requests over time is why a new home hasn't been purchased yet. He also insinuated that Tyler made his video for a, quote, juicy story, questioning why Tyler didn't reach out to him directly for clarification. While questions remain about Mark's approach and the Soft White Underbelly YouTube channel, many social media users continue to defend him, praising his compassion and appreciating how his content challenges assumptions about the realities of homelessness and drug addiction. Aside from Soft White Underbelly, there are other creators who have faced trauma porn allegations, with one of the most prominent creators being, of course, MrBeast and Beast Philanthropy. We spoke at length about MrBeast and the criticisms of his philanthropic content in our deep dive into him from February of this year. So if you're interested in the full picture, definitely go back to that episode and check it out. But MrBeast, the world's biggest YouTuber, has faced increased criticism for his do-gooder content. The basis of MrBeast's fame and fortune is his philanthropic content, where he gives away thousands, if not millions of dollars to people in his videos. In addition to giving away money, MrBeast creates savior content, where he will provide medical treatments or build shelter or infrastructure for marginalized people or low-income people. And while yes, the money that Jimmy has given away and the work that Beast Philanthropy has done has no doubt changed lives, let's zoom out for a minute and consider the problems with philanthropy as an industry. Private philanthropy has increased dramatically in the past 20 years, with nearly 3/4 of the world's philanthropic foundations being established during that time. British journalist Paul Valley reports that between all of them, these foundations control more than 1.5 trillion USD. One of the main issues with private philanthropy is that it's always a, quote, expression of power. It's a super rich individual picking and choosing the causes that matter to them, as opposed to, say, paying their fair share of taxes. It lets the super rich live out their God complex. They believe the answer to the world's problem is private philanthropy because they believe that they know where the money should go, that they know better than the governments or local members of that society. This can sometimes contradict or undermine the priorities of a community. We see this God complex mentality through MrBeast's content. He rarely addresses the wider systemic issues at play in his videos, and he absolutely always centers himself in these videos. His videos are about him giving back, not about the issues he's covering in his videos. And his audience plays into this. There are several videos on the MrBeast channel that take us through people's living conditions, showing us their car, painting a picture of vulnerability, poverty, and desperation. And then, to make us feel better about people living in these conditions, MrBeast swoops in to save them by handing them a wad of cash or paying for their healthcare or something. Rebecca McFarlane for Centennial World explores the consequences of this content, noting that, quote, all too often, the forces driving creators are sensationalization, notoriety, and profits. Rather than raising awareness or fostering empathy for the pain of others, this overt commodification of tragedy tends to have the opposite effect on audiences: desensitization. TikTok trends, video essays, and commentary are all examples of how this desensitization manifests in the digital era. The criticism against creators like Mark Leda and MrBeast are valid. Despite the good that they may be doing, they have arguably built multi-million-dollar businesses by exploiting other people's pain and suffering, and in turn, helping desensitize millions of people around the world to real-life tragedy. And while that seems to be an approach to trauma porn that most people would agree is questionable, creators who go viral by sharing their own traumatic stories, like Risa Tisa, who went viral in February of this year for her series on marrying a pathological liar, face fewer questions about the ethical implications of them creating this type of content, given it's their own story to tell. So, where does this leave us? Should we avoid engaging with or consuming trauma porn altogether? Or is this content already too ingrained in media and online culture to avoid? From my perspective, I do think that audiences have an element of accountability when it comes to what we consume and why we consume it. If Monster, for example, had not been such a success with audiences, then maybe Netflix and the showrunners would have been held to a different ethical standard when the victim's family spoke out about their lack of support for the series. However, as we explored, humans' penchant for bad news is nothing new, and it's unlikely that people will stop creating, consuming, and engaging with traumatic content despite the questionable ethics and motivations around it. Staying critical of who is creating this content and why they're creating it is probably the bare minimum we can do to support the people who were actually involved in these real-life tragedies before we turned them into trauma porn. Infinite Scroll is a podcast produced, presented, and co-written by me, Lauren Meisner, for Centennial World. This episode was researched and co-written by Annabelle Ben-David and edited by Danny Fennick. Thank you so much for listening. I love you guys, and I will talk to you next week. Bye.